Okay, it should start in half a minute or so.
Okay, cool.
It says it is now streaming live.
Okay.
Yeah, it takes a little bit of time to actually go live and show things on the
Got
Facebook
it.
page.
So I will start then. Okay. Hello, everyone. Today we will be talking about the book, The Sixth Extinction, An Unnatural History. And we are pleased to announce that the author of the book is here with us today. Hello, Elizabeth.
Hi, everyone.
Hey, so I will give a little introduction about Elizabeth. She is an American journalist and a visiting fellow at the Williams College at Massachusetts. She's an observer and a commentator on environmentalism for the New Yorker magazine. As of 2017, she has been serving as the member of the Atomic Scientist Science and Security Board. She studied literature at Yale and then got the Fulbright scholarship to study in the University of Hamburg. But she is most renowned for her book, The Sixth Extinction. It has won the Pulitzer Prize in 2015. The book was published in 2014. So we are very pleased to talk about this book today. So Elizabeth, first I ask to most of our guests, why do you write? How did you get passionate in writing? And mostly science books and on science.
Well, sorry, I'm trying to escape the sun. There's it's very, very sunny here today. I took a long and winding path to writing about science. I actually started out as a reporter for the New York Times, and I wrote about politics for a long time, actually. And then I went to the New Yorker in 1999, and I was actually supposed to write a political column, which I did do for a few years. But it was actually a time when the news cycle was speeding up a lot. It was sort of the beginning of internet news, and it became really hard to write about political news for a magazine that came out weekly. Everything was just very old by the time it came out, and I started to sort of think about stories that would be true, next week and the week after and the week after that. And that is how I eventually came to write a 3-part series on climate change. That was sort of my first big foray into science journalism. It was a big leap for me. And that came out in 2005, I guess. And, once you sort of start thinking about and reporting about climate change, it has a tendency to sort of take over your life. It's such a huge issue. And so that's really what happened to me. And that's this long and winding road. And that eventually, writing about climate change, eventually led me to write The Sixth Extinction.
Why did you get interested in talking about extinct animals, living things, and the extinction that is going on right now?
Well, after I read this book on climate change, I sort of started to write other pieces about, ways in which humanity is changing the planet on what is now, described as a geological scale. I mean, our impacts are, for all intents and purposes, permanent. And there are, unfortunately, a lot of ways. It's not just climate change. I mean, I talk about them in the book, and all of these things sort of came together under this rubric of this mass extinction event, which it seemed like, it wasn't like people weren't aware of it, but it seemed like it kind of wasn't getting the coverage it deserved. Our impacts on the millions of other species, we really don't know how many species there are that we share this planet with, but it seemed to me like a subject that deserved a pretty big treatment. So that's how I came to it.
So reading your book, I understand that you traveled to the places you were talking the story about. You went to Panama to see the Panamanian frogs. You went to the close to the Lake Champlain to a icy cave during the winter to see the bats hanging from there. So do you like to see the places you are talking about or travel to those places and get the first-hand experience to write about those things and know about the history of those living things?
Well, it's a common, I mean, most of those trips, I mean, even including the one where we went to the bat cave where most of the bats were dead, and it was really actually very, very gruesome, I have to say. But even that was really super interesting. So, you know, on the one hand, I would say, you know, yes, I just like to do it. It's really interesting. I've gotten to see amazing parts of the world while I was writing that book. But the other thing I would say is it's kind of necessary if you're doing journalism the way I do it, you know, to have some firsthand experience that you're relating. I think it would be very dry, you know, if I just wrote off of other people's experiences or other people's or scientific papers or whatever. So I think it's important to for both, you know, to both for your understanding as the author, but also for conveying a story that will kind of keep people reading. How's that? That you have some sort of adventures to relate.
Like people who don't know about the biological history of the organisms, if they read about the last 5 extinctions, they will see that after the extinction, there is a rise of a wide variety of different organisms and different diversity arrives. So somebody may think that, okay, then extinction is not that bad because there would be newer species. After dinosaurs left, we got the mammals and we became humans here. So why is this 6th extinction important for us to know and talk about? What is worse about it?
Well, there's a lot of different ways I could answer that question, and one of them is sort of encapsulated in your question, which is, you know, after the last major mass extinction, which was it's generally agreed was, you know, caused by an asteroid impact, and it did in the dinosaurs, it did in a lot of groups of very, very dominant creatures on Earth, not just the dinosaurs. And I think one of the lessons from that, dinosaurs were a very, very, very successful group of organisms, and not one exists today. So one of the sort of lessons of a mass extinction is that once you start, you know, this sort of extinction cascade, it's sometimes called, you don't know what's going to be left at the end. So as far as humanity is concerned, you know, yes, mammals arose out of the ashes of the end Cretaceous extinction, but who knows what will be the dominant group of organisms, you know, after this extinction event. So one reason you might be compelled to think about it is, you know, sheer self-preservation. How's that? But another reason to think about it very, very seriously is, you know, what you say, yeah, you know, something arose to take the place of all these species that had dropped out. But that process on a human time scale was, you know, impossibly slow, right? So after the end Cretaceous extinction, it took something like 10 million years for life to recover. You know, none of us is going to be around 10 million years from now. And the chances of humanity being around, I mean, the lifetime of the species, any species on Earth is pretty rarely 10 million years. So, you know, we don't really have 10 million years to wait around. So that's another reason to be pretty concerned about what's going on.
So do you think the human, if I say the species may survive 100 more thousand years, do you see they will get extinct before that? Like, are humans, like with our intelligence and the developments that we went through for the last 300 years, do you think we are less susceptible to extinct?
Yes, I mean, extinction requires killing off, every breeding pair. And, there's a lot of people on the planet right now. There's almost 7.8 billion people. As you say, we're very smart, we're very adaptable, we're creatures that, with the help of our technologies, and even really before people had very sophisticated technologies, have lived all around, have lived in polar regions, we live in tropical regions, so we're very adaptable organisms. I think we definitely have the capacity to do ourselves in. We still have tremendous stockpiles of nuclear warheads, and I think it's pretty clear if we really went at it, we could do in most of humanity, maybe not every last breeding pair, but we could get close. But barring that, I think it's quite possible our species has a long time left on this planet, but there's a distinction between going extinct and changing the planet in such ways that you'll produce a lot of human misery. I think there's quite possibly that's much more my concern than we're going to actually, do in the last, breeding pairs of humans.
So this idea of we will survive for longer time, does this give us the freedom or will to do whatever we want and don't care about the earth and do much harm on the nature and stuff? Does this give us the assurance that, okay, we will survive, so we don't care about other species?
Well, that's sort of the attitude we're taking, I have to say. But, I think, and once again, it seems to me your question almost answers itself. I mean, obviously, that's to take that, there's, I should say, once again, there's two ways to answer that. The idea that humanity could just sort of do in, the majority or a large proportion of the other species on Earth, and we wouldn't feel the impacts, I think is probably folly. I mean, at the end of the day, many of us live in cities. We have very attenuated connection with, what I'll call the natural world, for lack of a better term. But still, we are biological. We're just animals like other animals, and everything we eat is biological agent. I mean, we're not just living on, chemicals that we synthesize. Though maybe one day we will. So I don't want to preclude that possibility. How's that? But so one reason you might want to take care of the biosphere is because we depend on it. And another reason, a more abstract reason, but I think an equally compelling one in my view, is, do we want the legacy of humanity on Earth to be what we did in just about everything else? We're in the process of doing in our very closest relatives. Modern genetics has taught us, and Darwin already was, convinced of this, that the great apes were our closest relatives. We're we have share a common ancestor, obviously, with chimps, with gorillas, with orangutans, and all of those species of great apes are endangered at this point. Some really, really seriously, gorillas very seriously endangered. And so our legacy will already be to have, if not done in, then severely restricted the numbers of our very closest relatives. And, moving out from there, just everything else on the planet is now, unfortunately, in our hands in a certain sense. And we may not want to acknowledge that, but I think it's very important that we bring that into global consciousness, because that is a huge responsibility that we're not really facing up to. How's that?
Yeah, just to let the audiences know, you please ask questions, raise your hand or write on the chat box if you are on Zoom, or whoever are seeing in the Facebook, please write your questions or comments in the comment box. I will take the questions from you guys shortly, but first I also want to include, Elizabeth, that the greater greatest threat we are facing now is the climate change that uh, has been done by us humans. So if you, my question is, if we stop or slow down the climate change that is going on, will it slow down the extinction, the sixth extinction process alone?
Well, I mean, climate change is unfortunately, just one of the ways we're driving this extinction crisis. And I think one of the points that I really try to emphasize in the book, and once again, it's not like, an original point. It's not like everything in the book was was imparted to me by the scientists whom I spoke to. So I don't want to claim once again that these are my ideas, but that one of the key drivers here is the rate of change, right? So, every organism that has evolved on Earth is on some level capable of dealing with change, because there is change on Earth. Always temperatures change, terrain changes even. The organisms that you have to share your habitat with change. But change tends in the natural world to happen very slowly because it's generally driven by evolution, which is a slow process. And the problem that we have now, and so, we've had ice ages, right, in the relatively recent past, and a lot of organisms, every organism that's around today survived that ice age. And generally they did that by migrating, right? They moved, they tried to track the climate. And that was possible when people weren't in the way, right? So now we are, I quote someone in the book who says, we've changed the rule, we've moved the goalposts and we've changed the rules of the game. We're compelling everything to move really fast. The climate is changing really fast compared to other moments of climate change in the past. And we have built our cities, we've built our mines, we have huge plantations of monoculture crops that provide no nutrition, for many, many species. So we are just pushing things to move, and then we're saying, but you can't go here. And when you think about that, that's just a calamitous situation for many, many organisms.
Okay, thank you. Kostu, please go ahead if you have any questions. I will ask later.
We also wanted to ask you a bit about science communication in general. And a lot of our audiences are young scientists or science students themselves, especially young women scientists. And they really look up to someone like you and be inspired. So if you have any suggestions to these young scientists about how to become a successful science writer, and especially to these young women listeners, then that'll be great.
Well, I think one of the, I often describe what I do as, or think of what I do, how's that, as almost a form of translation. I take, scientific concepts and research, I try to translate it into everyday, ordinary English. And I think that one of the barriers to science communication, and it afflicts a lot of scientists, so it's something I think that your listeners who are scientists and who are thinking about this in their own lives should think about, is that people get so into the field that they are pursuing. There's a lot of jargon in those fields, and I don't say that pejoratively. I mean, there's a lot of technical language, I suppose is a better way of saying it. But people just don't understand it. The people that you're trying to communicate with are not in your field, and so that sense that, can you explain it to your mom? Can you explain it to your grandmother? That is important to keep in mind, because those are if you're trying to reach a general audience, those are the people that you're trying to reach. And so I personally do not have a science background. I am, I studied literature. And so I always kind of feel like, well, if I understand it, then hopefully my readers will too. Sometimes that's not true, but that's an important thing, I think, for scientists to think about, not to get so wrapped up in their own world that they don't realize that, that word, that phrase, that doesn't mean anything to most people. So that would be kind of rule number one in my book.
And would you have any specific advice for our women listeners?
Well, I think, I don't know that I have any particular advice in terms of science communication. I mean, I think it's, I don't want to say it's gender neutral, but pretty gender neutral. I mean, if you're talking to a lay audience composed of, any group of people, I think that the demands are the same. Now, I'm sure that there are all sorts of issues about women in science and the complexities of being a woman scientist that I'm afraid I'm not the person to answer, because I'm not a scientist. So I don't feel competent to really address those issues.
We could talk a little bit about the current situation, combining COVID and other issues in which we have generally seen mistrust of accurate reports and facts, not just from scientists, but also anyone who tries to report them accurately. So in this situation, what do you think should be done? Because people are putting the facts there, but other people are not just trusting them. So in this situation, and this is same for climate change, this is same for COVID and everything. So what do you think of the situation?
I think it's really scary and really, revelatory because, and I think scientists often beat themselves up, and there's a lot of, soul searching going on in the scientific community. Like, what, are we communicating badly? Are we responsible for this? And I don't want to, let scientists completely off the hook. But as you say, look, the information is out there, and the human impulse, once again, which we're seeing play itself out in some pretty weird ways, I have to say, to believe what's not true, believe bad information over accurate information because it's inconvenient, or I don't really know. I'm really struggling with this myself right now, because in the case of climate change, you could say, well, any individual is not going to make a huge difference, whether climate change gets dealt with or not, right? And so if I drive my big car, or if I fly around the world or whatever, I could always say, well, it doesn't really matter. And I could convince myself even maybe that climate change isn't real and it's not going to affect me. But COVID is a direct threat to the health of, everyone. There's no one who's immune. None of us have immunity. That's the problem. And we're seeing that, even young people can be very severely affected and have long-term health impacts. So, you'd think that just sheer self-interest, you'd think that a creature that evolved, to survive would have to have the capacity to judge bad information from good, otherwise we wouldn't be here. And yet here we are, struggling with the same issues that people believing things that you would think, well, wouldn't even be plausible, 500 years ago. So it's kind of weird and kind of alarming. How's that? I don't have a good answer. I wish I did.
Yeah, thank you. Over to you then, Kanashan.
Yeah, thanks. Our kind of related question. So there are mixed opinions about bringing the extinct animals back by the modern genetics, biotechnology stuff. So like people have tried to bring back the gastric brooding frog, the ibex from the Europe, and trying the mammoth now. Uh, what do you think about these approaches? Should we bring back if we can, should we bring back the extinct animals?
Well, I think as a, kind of interesting science project, those efforts are really interesting, and, they're really fascinating intellectual, scientific challenge. I mean, the gastric brooding frog effort failed. I think it's basically kaput now. The ibex, they succeeded in, creating, I think, one calf that lived for a few minutes, but it was had very serious problems and died very quickly. So these things are incredibly labor intensive at this point. They are pretty much doomed. They don't seem to work very well. When you create, one of a species, you have no way to reproduce. You have to create two of the species. It kind of depends what you're starting with, so there's a lot of important, there's a lot of just technical challenges that we have not figured out how to solve. But, people are really smart. Genetics is moving really fast. So I think it may well be possible at some moment to reach some kind of approximation of bringing something back. But then you have to ask yourself, what are you bringing back? All organisms of any, I don't want to say where the dividing line is because I don't know, but one of the things that they've really learned in terms of just bringing species back from the brink of extinction, not using genetic engineering at all, just like we had a small group of animals and then we bred them up in captivity and now we're trying to release them into the wild again. They face tremendous problems because they're captive animals. They can't function outside of a zoo or outside of a cage. They were not trained. They didn't have parents who taught them. Like, I'll give you a very vivid example. There's a bird, a crow in Hawaii that was brought back from the very brink of extinction through a captive breeding process. And they finally got to the point where they had enough that they wanted to put them out into a non-enclosed area. And what happened immediately was that they got killed by hawks. So they had to go back and try to train them with sort of hawk puppets, avoid hawks. So animals are not just their genetics. They also have, education, as it were. And so there are all sorts of questions that arise from this that I think at the end of the day confine this de-extinction to a kind of a curiosity. It doesn't really deal with the problem at hand. How's that? And moreover, I should also add, we don't even know what's going extinct. I mean, animals are going extinct before we even know what they are. So that we're not bringing those back because we don't even know what they were.
Yeah, somebody, our researcher Mike Archer once said that like people argue against this, and for the bringing back is that you are bringing the equilibrium back in the nature. So researcher Archer said that there is no equilibrium in the nature ever. So you cannot just bring something back to bring back some equilibrium.
Yeah, exactly. And you have to ask, why did it go extinct in the first place? And oftentimes, like the gastric brooding frog, that's a really, really interesting animal. Just for your audience, the gastric brooding frog was a frog that gestated its young in its stomach, and and then sort of spit them out, vomited them out. So it was really interesting. It was two species in Australia, and they both went extinct. And I think it's pretty widely agreed that they went extinct due to a fungal disease, which has really circled the globe and has had devastating effect on many, many amphibians, driven many species to extinction. And that's still out there, so you bring them back. Once again, they would have to stay in a lab. A lot of these animals, the reasons for their extinction, unless you deal with those, you're just going to have the same problem all over again.
Along with that, there was a frog I read some years ago in Australia. They brought it there to eat some insects and they became pests now, those frogs themselves. So this is another problem. And you actually mentioned in one of the chapters, I guess in the New Pangea, the name of the chapter, where you were saying that because we travel more and more, we bring new and newer infectious agents with us and introduce it to a new environment where the animal or the living stock there are susceptible to them and not resistant to those new threats. So that is also another, you gave multiple examples of those. For example, the bat close to the Lake Champlain cave, uh, those fungi, right? Those fungi
Yeah,
were brought there from Europe, I guess, because people
that's the
travel.
theory. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So what, and also traveling also brought new species, new plants, new vegetables, to introduce them to different areas of the world as well. But extinction also occurs, and kind of hand in hand to the having those uh, we get new species in our area or our land, etc. But how do we actually counter this problem, that the pests also come along with good stuff?
well, that's I think a really really hard one, and that's why or one of the reasons that this extinction crisis is really hard to deal with. And I mean, I think COVID has really brought home how easy it is to move a microorganism around the world, and how dangerous that is. So in a world that's so interconnected the way our world is, we are constantly moving things around. And most of the time, if you take an organism from, or even a pathogen from its sort of native habitat, you move it somewhere else, it just dies. It doesn't have a big impact. But if you're moving tens of thousands of organisms around the world every day, all it takes is a really small fraction of them to be dangerous, to cause a big problem. And we're going to, I think, and I don't think this is a controversial statement, just keep seeing more and more of these devastating um, pathogens that are devastating. What's devastating about the fungal disease that's afflicting amphibians and bats is they are fatal to many species, not even just one species. Where I live in New England, where you are in Boston, we have an insect, the emerald ash borer, that was imported from Asia. It's killing all the ash trees. Ash is a huge component of our forests here in New England. This follows a fungal disease that killed all the chestnut trees in the early part of the 20th century. So, we are really, really changing the world really fast. The more globalized we are, the more that's going to happen. And when you think of the creatures that depended on ash trees or depend on chestnut trees, they fall out as well. So uh, there are countries, there are parts of the world where they are try to be very, very vigilant. For example, New Zealand, they're an island. They've been separated from everywhere, including Australia, for a really long time. They try to be vigilant because they feel like their native fauna and even their farming is very susceptible to outside invaders. But if they're microbial, there's just no way, to screen for that very effectively. So it's a very, very, very tough situation, and I don't have an answer for that. There are things that people have proposed, for example, that a lot of species are moved around in ballast water of our super tankers, that ballast water should basically be zapped, maybe with UV light or something, to before it's just dumped in a new body of water, so that there are ways that we could try to minimize those impacts, but eliminating them, I think, is honestly virtually impossible at this point.
Yeah. Um, One of the stories from your book that was striking to me was that how late we knew about the extinction process. Like before 200 years, we did not know that there could be extinct animals living here, and there would be more animals living on Earth than that is present now. uh, and before George Cuvier actually introduced strongly to us. And now school children learn about extinct animals and play with dinosaur fossils and stuff. What changed it dramatically 200 years ago? Is it only the fossil records uh, and and just fossil records?
Well, the fossils were really important, and one of the interesting things is that it was a sort of as the Europeans went out and colonized and sort of plundered the rest of the world, they came in contact with uh, fossils, or some of them aren't even really fossils. They were things that were pretty close to the surface of the earth. They were sort of subfossils. How's that? Um, that they realized, well, those just aren't around anymore, But it was a pretty long debate. Cuvier he had this great insight, if you want to say, that he looked at these bones that were in the Museum of Natural History in Paris already at the end of the 18th century, and said, look, these are not around anymore. People had thought that mammoth bones, they were just elephants that had been washed north into Siberia or whatever by the flood in Genesis in the Bible. And he said, no, if you look at the bones, they're not elephants. If you look at their teeth, they're different. They're not elephants. They're something different, and they don't exist anymore. But people, as I talk about in the book, people like even Thomas Jefferson, pretty smart guy, he insisted that they were going to find mastodons out in the American West, because there was this sort of just prevailing belief that everything that God had made on planet Earth was, why would he make something and then destroy it? So that was tough to overcome. That was a sort of big paradigm shift, as they say in the scientific world. It was a paradigm shift before there were really paradigm shifts. But he faced a lot of resistance. But as those bones, really, of these enormous creatures, which were hard to sort of imagine they were just hiding somewhere, came to light, people had to acknowledge, well, yeah, they're just not around anymore. And no one has seen a mastodon on the American continent. And so we kind of have to agree that they just can't be here anymore.
Right. And speaking of that, it is very difficult to change the mindset of the general people if it is biased by some religious belief. Uh, for example, the evolution people, if you believe in Genesis in the religious books, people tend to not accept the fact that there is evolution going on. And this is a really big problem in our society as well, that the conservative society, the people who believe in the religious text line by line, they don't try to accept the scientific facts. So as a popular science writer, what do you think one or two things that help changing uh, the situation, and also make people more trusting the science and facts?
Well, that kind of, gets back to the question we were talking about before, like, how is there so much misinformation about COVID, something that, threatens people's lives very directly? Whereas if you believe in evolution, or, don't believe in evolution, is that going to really impact your personal life? Not that much, probably. But, it certainly would prevent you from getting a, job teaching biology. But I think that, when I write, I try to write to as broad an audience as I can. How's that? And I try not to be hostile, to my audience. But, that being said, I'm not trying to convince you that, evolution is occurring. If you really don't believe, if your convictions, religious convictions, say, well, that's just all wrong, you would have a hard time reading my books. You would not. You just would say, well, she's just part of that great big propaganda machine that's pushing this crazy theory of evolution. And I don't have a way, and I don't I think a lot of people who are, smarter than I and know a lot more about evolution than I have cracked their heads on that one, and we're still fighting over it, which I think says a lot about the capacity for humans to believe things in spite massive, massive amounts of evidence. How's that?
So did you receive some sort of pushback from these kind of people about your book?
No, I really didn't. And I don't know if that's, I don't know whether to be, insulted by that or flattered by it, but I didn't, I don't think I ever rose to the level of importance to really be taken on by people. And as I said, I don't really take people on. I don't say, well, you're an idiot if you don't believe it. I just put that issue to the side. And so a lot of people just who either deny evolution or deny climate change, they just didn't read the book. Now some people were probably assigned it in their classes, but I did not get much. I just did not get much pushback. I have to say. Now a lot of people do, but I have not.
And since you wrote the book, the due to the climate change, a lot of species has been wiped out, and like very quickly, and things have been changing very quickly too. If you were to rewrite the book now, what would be the changes you want to make?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, there are a lot of crises, a lot of animals, a lot of species that have made headlines. Those tend to be, very charismatic species, like this porpoise that lives in the Gulf of Mexico, or lived in the Gulf of Mexico, the vaquita, which is probably, extinct now or down to a handful of members. So there have been a lot of species that have made news, but I think the big story that I would include in the book that I did not have at that point is what's happening to insects. I mean, most of the diversity on planet Earth is actually insects. And there's increasing amounts of evidence, increasing numbers of studies that suggest that even a lot of insect species are in trouble. If that's true, I think that's the bottom of the food chain. That's really serious. So I would definitely have a chapter on insects now. That's one thing I would really have.
Yeah, speaking of that, I was writing 2 or 3 months ago about how less insects we see on our windshields now while driving through the landscape of the rural areas in the North America. And I used to see a lot of insects before 10 years before. Now it's getting lesser and lesser. It's really visible.
Yeah, no, there's actually a phrase, it's called the windshield effect, and many people have noted it. And I think you're right. And I also live out, I live out in, it's not really rural, but it's kind of semi-rural. And, if you put a light on in the porch, you used to see a lot of moths, and pretty big moths, and you really just don't anymore. So it's pretty scary. That's pretty scary. And people don't know why exactly. Is it climate change? Is it light pollution? Is it pesticides? So that's I think very, very alarming.
Are you planning to write anything in near future?
Yes, I actually have a new book coming out in a couple months. So it took me a while to write another one. It takes you a while to gear up and write another book, but I do have another book coming out over the winter.
Okay, I will ask one or two more questions, but from the audience, please ask your questions or raise your hand if you have any question, and from the Facebook too. Kostub, you want to ask any question? Please go ahead.
Well, I wanted to ask what the new book is about.
Well, this sort of short answer is it's about ways in which we're trying to grapple with precisely the problems that we've caused. We realize we've done a lot of things, sort of imposing ourselves on the natural world. We don't like the results And now we're trying to correct for that, often by imposing new forms of technology or new forms of control. So that's really what the book is about.
Uh, because you are a journalist and you write about science, I don't know if you face the same problem as we face when we write up in Bengali. We have to translate a lot of new science words because science produces newer and newer words every day.
Yeah.
And it kind of an inventive process if you go think about the root of the word, where it came from and how it is named in English. Do you face similar kind of problem with some of the things you write about?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that gets back to this idea that, we're sort of translating for a general audience, but, a lot of terms that very quickly move through the scientific community, they're meaningless to most people, and so you have to I don't have to try to come up with new words the way you do, but I do have to try to explain to people, or maybe come up with a workaround for terms that are really not in ordinary people's vocabulary yet, or and will never be. They'll never be part of sort of everyday English.
Yeah, there is one problem I face is that people tend to not accept new words in our language. They tend to keep it in English and think that English is the language of science in the world, so we should not change and things.
That's how
in
English
really,
is infiltrating a lot of languages. Yeah,
right,
all
right.
around the world, I think. Yeah.
But really keeping it in Bengali and surviving the Bengali language in science, we actually need to make new words and practice writing in Bengali. So this is
Yeah.
really important. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting conundrum. How's that? I don't have a good answer for that. Yeah.
Has your book been translated into Bengali? Do you know? I haven't found any.
I don't think it has. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Sadly, it got translated to a bunch of languages. I have them up on my shelf, and I don't think it was ever translated into Bengali, unfortunately.
So I guess some of our editors or writers or translators, they probably will be willing to translate this book. I will approach to someone. Uh, can I email you about the writing?
Sure.
The
Yeah. I
translation
mean,
right?
obviously there's a complex, I don't really control that even, I think, translation rights, but yeah, definitely email me.
Okay. If no one has any more question, okay, there is one comment, right, in the Facebook. I'm reading the comment for you.
Okay.
All the evidences point that we, the humans, are initiating the changes which results in the extinction of the animal species. Yet there is a large fraction of people who deny this. Perhaps letting humanity go extinct will bring about the solution of the problem. No, I don't think so, but
Oh, that's one way to go. Yeah, that would. But it's a little bit like COVID. Even people who some people who got hospitalized with COVID said, "Oh yeah, I should have paid more attention. I should have listened to the scientists." Yeah.
yeah, one way, I guess those are more nihilistic people. They say that what if we get extinct? Well, like we all get extinct and then new species will arrive, I guess, from
Yes,
the asteroids.
that's pretty nihilistic. I have to agree. But it is one way to look at things. But it does absolve us of a lot of responsibility. Again, it's just jumping right to humans are going to go extinct. And as I said before, I don't think that's happening anytime soon, unless we decide to blow ourselves up.
Right. Okay, Elizabeth, thank you very much for attending the session here. It was our pleasure to have you here.
Oh, well, thanks for having me.
Thank you,
And
Elizabeth.
thanks for the book. Wonderful book. We really enjoyed reading it. And I guess the readers and audience also enjoyed.
Okay, well,
Thank you
great.
very much.
Thank you.
Okay,
Bye.
nice to meet you all.
Nice to meet you.
Okay,
Take care.
bye-bye.